In the midst of waiting for roster changes to erupt, I felt that it fit that I cover one particular team that has already made a roster change up to this point, and that is UYU. Now, immediately as I say the name UYU, most people think, okay, big deal. It's not Optic, it's not Envy, it's not a United. I'm out of here. Not even worth my time to hear even anyone talk about them. But I want to talk about this team change because I think coming into the roster change period, they actually have a very solid upside. Like, they actually do have a very good chance of being a decent team in terms of how they compete with some of the best rosters out there in regards to Optic and VE United, if you want to throw a few of those out there. Now, the change was announced that Gorgonite, aka Knight, is now an unrestricted free agent from the team and is no longer going to be in the starting lineup moving forward in the Pro League. And from what I've been told from sources, was that it was a team decision, and UYU wanted to essentially release him as soon as they possibly could to allow him an opportunity to join teams if he ended up getting the opportunity. Now, I want to go back a little bit, because ever since UYU made the initial decision to pick up Parzilian, I've gone on the record many times saying that was a great move. And the reason why is because it was. It actually was a great move that they made to increase their AR talent. It was probably one of the best moves in the last roster change period. I would put it probably top 3. You could argue it was one of the better ones in terms of just strictly how they looked on paper. You could argue the results in the end maybe didn't necessarily lead to that same result. However, I've always been one to say as well, along with that roster change, okay, great. Now you've got some super solid AR talent. How do you capitalize on that? It's one thing to gain the talent. It's another thing to see results with it, right? So you've got Methods, you've got Mayhem, and you've got Parzilian, a solid core of Maddoxes and ICRs, guys that can definitely contend. However, the way that you capitalize on that is also by having well-rounded submachine players, by having well-rounded SMG stats. Now, I want to go over quickly the overall Pro League SMG KD stats from UYU. I'm going to kind of point out where I feel like a lot of the struggles are starting to come from. So this is overall throughout the entirety of the Pro League. In terms of strictly SMG stats, Hardpoint, they possessed a 0.93 average, S&D a 0.85 average, and Control a 0.91, and overall it equaled out to a 0.91. Okay, not the worst, not the greatest by any means in terms of like strictly SMGs. You could argue how they kind of balance it out compared to other rosters, but in terms of the record before and after Parzilian, they were 2-5 before him. Whenever they added him to the team in cross-divisional play, they went 1-3. So not really much of an improvement. You could argue pretty much the same record in terms of, if you double it, right, 2-6, pretty much the same record in terms of probably what they would have placed. So not much of an improvement whatsoever, despite it being one of the better changes that we saw in regards to how the roster change period went. Now, something else to look at, in the last 3 games that UYU played, they went 0-3. Now, there are overall roll KD averages from 3 of these games. I'm going to try to cover these because I think this is a really important stat line to bring up. In the last 3 losses that UYU suffered, the SMG's KD average was a 0.73. The AR's KD average was a 0.91. Now, don't get me wrong, the ARs aren't looking that great either, but a 0.73. Now, often you rely on your submachine guns here, and this is just me totally speaking, but you rely on your SMGs to kind of entry, right? To try to find some initial kills, to kind of free up for the ARs. They kind of have a little bit of a trade-off to a certain extent. Maybe the ARs kind of scout information. They gain the line sights. The SMGs are the one to entry. And even in Search and Destroy, and everyone, their big topic has been, oh my gosh, UYU's Search and Destroy record. But a lot of the times that relies on First Bloods, that relies on a lot of little things. And so for me, that could be the basis of where we're seeing UYU struggle quite a bit, because that 0.73 KD is just not going to get it done in any sense of the word, right? So I was going to mention this earlier, but I think now's a fit time. Overall, UYU, as of this moment, sits 6th in Division A at 4-7. And I think if we were to do those series over again, in which they won, I'd be interested in a rematch versus Heretics. I'll give you EG on LAN, in which they won that series, but they aren't beating Luminosity, especially on LAN. And based on the way that we saw Reciprocity play, I don't think that's happening either. So you could argue maybe 2 of those victories based off of now. Do they win those again? If they rematch, do they logistically have a solid chance? And if we're talking about at a LAN tournament, probably not. So the emphasis that I want to really illustrate is that in my eyes, UYU needs to rebuild from an SMG point of view, right? They've made a good step already, right? In terms of wanting to try to change up the team, I think is a good idea. There's a lot of teams who want to try to stray away from roster changes, and then once they see everyone else starting to make changes, they're saying, okay, well, the end crowd's doing it, I might as well do it too. They get peer pressured into wanting to do what other organizations are. They see players and they're like, oh, wow, that looks pretty nice, and they decide to grab them as they start to fall. Now, I want to be clear. I think that where they currently sit is where I would be doing as well. I'd be doing the exact same thing if I was in their position, and pretty much being aware of your surroundings, right? If we have the idea to release 2 of our SMG players, let's keep 1 just in case things don't work out as a kind of backup plan. Now we only have to replace 1 player rather than 2. And from what I've heard personally from sources as well, it seems as if they have brought on an interest in someone like Jet Li from Accelerate, and based on their market they have available, that probably could be their sole option, right? You talk about SMGs, it's a hot commodity right now. Everybody wants to have one. And I'm not sure if they could find someone to overall replace the team that would make them a logistic factor, one that could really kind of improve that 0.73 KD to something around a 1. But I say all of that, and I can get into this at another time, but I think UYU finds themselves in a position that is very, very common to a lot of organizations. The org will say, we need a certain role to improve our team. Well, there's nobody available for that. Okay, well, what's the easiest way to get a player? There are no options in the league available. What's our next option to look toward if no one in the league is out there? There's a lot of questions that kind of go on through a lot of GMs' minds, through a lot of organizations' minds, and much like how the NBA works, and this happens all the time, especially with lesser-known names, lesser-known teams in regards to the NBA, or even, like you talk about other franchise sports, they look toward free agency, right? They look toward, in Call of Duty situation, you could label it as the amateur/semi-pro scene, players who aren't signed. And this is what is allowing for top-tier organizations to constantly have an easy rebuild, to have an easy little reboot to their system. You talk about FaZe Clan. They're ready, right? They're always ready. They acquire FC Black, a group of really talented young players that you could argue almost all of them could probably be in the league as of this moment. Phantoms, ASIM, Gravity, Salient, all of those guys could easily be in the league. And obviously there's Zuma, but we all know, Zuma's situation, right? Before that, E United, right? They make the EU cadets. They help funnel in and contract one of the most coveted players of all time, waiting for him to turn the age of 18, and Simp. And they made the quickest and easiest transition because E United thought ahead. They realized the situation that they had in front of them and said, hey, it'd be really nice to have a little security clause, right? The whole issue with JCap, that went down, right? But they could have found themselves in a financial problem where they're trying to acquire a player that's 50, 60K buyout to replace someone like JCap, when in reality, we already had this guy contracted, right? We've been planning for this for 2 years now, for a year and a half. We've been ready for this position to occur, and that's one thing that I really value about teams like FaZe and E United, especially as of recently, because I know there's been Academy teams in the past, but they've really been highlighting it on it, especially this year heading into franchising, and they're aware of that question that organizations constantly ask themselves, okay, no one's available in the league, what do we do now? Do we try to trade? Well, what if no one's interested in a trade? You constantly put yourself pretty much in a bubble. And it's like I said, it's the easiest thing in the world when United made that change. Organizations, and maybe this will change with franchising next season, need to expand their horizons to young and upcoming talent. Because this year, 24 new players that had never played in the CWL joined. The CWL was filled at the very beginning of the year, was filled with 30% of new players coming into this season. With that expansion, it's important to realize that even just speaking and being involved with the AM scene, coming into an expensive franchising year, it's important to be involved with it. And if you're in UYU situation, it's important to be involved with it. And I want to get back to the situation at hand because I think UYU has a great base. They have a really good foundation for their team, but my question comes up every single time, how can you improve on that, right? How are you going to pretty much capitalize on what you have as of this moment? That's the question they're probably finding themselves in right now. And even in preparation for CWL London, they seem to currently, and even after this roster change period, to by far have the easiest pool. Like everyone's discussion has been, wow, look at A, B, and C, but Pool D, not the pool of death by any means right now, right? So I think for them, they have a really solid chance to get a decent seed heading into the winners bracket. And obviously, once you get in the winners bracket, it's a totally different story. But you talk about, hey, pool play should be fairly easy, right? The very beginning stages of the tournament, if we have new players, there's a really good chance for us to kind of warm up and get used to this team before we head into the fray with the big dogs. So I think they have a really good chance, if they can capitalize, to have a decent start at least at CWL London, which not many teams are going to have that opportunity to. They're going to be thrown into the ringer immediately. At least for UYU, they might have a chance to kind of test things out a little bit and kind of have a little bit of room to grow, essentially, in regards to that point. And going quickly back with franchising in mind, organizations need to be ahead of schedule, right? They essentially need to arrive early when franchising rolls around next year. Now, will UYU be involved? That's obviously a different story. It's still a question that's in the air. However, the last roster change period should act only as a grace period. No total reboots should be done during that time. So I feel like I said, to kind of reference back, I think UYU has a very solid core of players. I absolutely do. I think that they could be a super solid team, but they need to improve on the SMG side of things. But I feel like many orgs at this point, and UYU in the same extent, get put into a box for creativity and movement during roster change periods because of the lack of expansion into the amateur scene. And I think if UYU handle their cards right and work with what they've got, they could actually be a decent team. They could really improve as a roster because we talk about their AR talent. It's there. It's apparent. There's no questions about it. Now, how do you capitalize on it? But they're going to have to whittle a lot in order to make their championship aspirations and their contention aspirations a possibility. They've got to handle their cards right because up to this point, not many organizations are doing that in regards to how you funnel and how do you improve your roster.